The dust storm came without mercy, swallowing the horizon in a wave of choking gray. Alone on her dying farm, Eloise McCarty heard the desperate knock of strangers at her door. Cowboys lost in the storm, starving, broken, forgotten by the world. She could barely feed herself, but somehow she found enough to feed them. She thought they'd disappear with the winds. Instead, 2 days later, a line of riders appeared on the edge of her land, carrying a debt of gratitude that no storm could ever erase. The wind had a sound that night, a low, growling moan, like something wounded and angry dragging itself across the plains. Eloise McCarty stood on the sagging porch of her farm, one hand gripping the wooden post, her skirts snapping around, her legs. She knew that sound. Everyone who had survived the last storm did. It was the sound of a dust storm big enough to strip the land bare, big enough to bury dreams beneath 1,000 choking layers of earth. The horizon was gone. The sun, once a molten coin above the fields, had disappeared behind a rolling wall of gray. The cattle were already restless, their lowing desperate and broken. Eloise glanced at the sky, murmured a prayer without thinking, and pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. She had no man to help her now. No neighbors who cared enough to lend a hand. Just her and the land, and even the land was turning against her. She was about to retreat inside when she heard it. A shout, faint against the howl of the wind. Then, another. Shapes emerged from the gloom, stumbling figures with hats pulled low, scarves tied around their faces. Cowboys, 3 of them, strangers. Eloise's heart lurched. In these parts, a knock on the door after sundown usually meant trouble. But these men didn't have the look of raiders or thieves. They moved like men barely holding on, like men the storm was trying to swallow whole. The first one, a broad-shouldered man with a limp, reached the steps and pulled down his scarf. His face was coated in dust, his lips cracked, his eyes bloodshot. "Ma'am," he croaked, tipping his hat. We ain't looking for no trouble, just shelter if you'd allow it." Eloise hesitated. Instinct screamed caution. She had a shotgun behind the door, but what good would it do against 3 grown men if their minds turned dark? And yet, something in their faces, something worn and human, reached her. She nodded once and pushed the door open wider. Inside, the farmhouse smelled of wood smoke and old bread. The men stamped the dust from their boots and removed their hats, their movement slow, almost reverent. They hovered near the door as if afraid to contaminate the space with their brokenness. Eloise moved to the kitchen, her hands moving on their own. A bit of cornmeal, some bacon fat. She scraped together what little she had left, making a rough skillet of cornbread and heating water for coffee so weak it was almost clear. As she worked, she glanced at them. 2 of the men murmured thanks, exhaustion pulling their shoulders. Low. But the third one, the quietest, stood apart. He was tall, with a scar slicing from the corner of his eyebrow to the edge of his cheek. His coat was patched, his boots worn to the sole, but he carried himself with a stillness that unsettled her more than any weapon might have. He didn't speak. He didn't sit. He simply watched her with those pale, unreadable eyes. When she finally set the food on the table, the 2 talkative ones dug in with quiet groans of gratitude. The silent one waited until she gave a slight nod before he took a piece of cornbread in his hand, breaking it slowly, almost methodically. They ate in near silence, save for the storm battering the windows and the occasional clink of tin cups against the table. Afterward, the 2 men mumbled apologies and found spots near the hearth to sleep. The silent one remained standing, staring into the flames, lost in a world Eloise could not enter. She watched him for a moment longer, then pulled a worn blanket from the chest by the wall and set it on the edge of the table. "For you," she said quietly. The man's head tilted slightly, as if acknowledging her, but he said nothing. Still, when she turned away, she heard the soft rustle of the blanket being lifted. That night, as the wind screamed against the walls, and the dust seeped through every crack, Eloise lay awake in her narrow bed. The house felt too full and too empty all at once. She had given shelter to strangers. She had fed them with food she could not spare. And somehow, deep in her bones, she knew this night was not the end of it. Something had shifted, carried on the breath of the storm. She just didn't know yet whether it was salvation or ruin. Morning came slow and heavy, dragging a haze of red light across the battered fields. The storm had passed, but it had left its scars. Drifts of dust as high as a man's knee, broken branches littering the yard, and a silence so deep it felt almost sacred. Eloise stirred from a restless sleep. For a moment she forgot the world outside her thin walls, forgot the weight that sat perpetually on her chest. Then the faint smell of dust and sweat reminded her. The strangers. She rose quietly, gathering, her shawl around her shoulders, and padded barefoot to the main room. The two talkative cowboys were gone. Their bedrolls were neatly folded by the hearth, a small stack of coins left atop them. Payment maybe, or a gesture of thanks. Eloise stared at the coins for a long moment, the metallic gleam looking almost foreign in her modest home. Only one man remained, the silent one. He stood by the window, his broad frame outlined against the weak morning light. His hat was pulled low, but she could see the tightness in his jaw, the way his hand flexed at his side like he was bracing for a blow that never came. Eloise cleared her throat softly. "Coffee's cold, but you're welcome to it." He turned slightly, offering a nod. Still, no words. She busied herself at the stove, reheating the dregs of yesterday's brew. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from something harder to name. This man unsettled her, not because he seemed dangerous, but because he seemed familiar somehow, worn down by life, fractured. When she placed the cup on the table, he stepped forward and accepted it with a quiet murmur that might have been, "Thank you," but was swallowed by the creaking of the floorboards. They sat in silence, the thin walls, breathing in and out with the wind. Finally, she found her voice. "You got a name?" He hesitated, as if weighing the risk of answering. Then in a voice rough as gravel, he said, "Calder." Just that, no surname, no explanation. Eloise nodded slowly. Calder, a strong name. A man built like the storms he traveled through. Silent, relentless, impossible to predict. "You planning to ride out today?" she asked, keeping her tone light. Calder's eyes, pale and sharp as winter ice, flicked to the door. Beyond it, the world was still buried in dust. Roads would be impassable. Towns would be closed up tight. "No good heading nowhere yet," he said simply. Eloise nodded again, though a strange knot twisted in her stomach. She didn't know if she should feel relieved or afraid. She spent the day working what little land she could, her boots kicking up powder where once there had been grass. Calder helped without asking, repairing a broken fence, hauling water from the well. He didn't speak unless necessary, but his presence was solid, unintrusive, like a boulder in a raging river. That night, they sat by the hearth again, nursing, weak coffee and staring into the fire. Eloise found herself speaking more than she meant to. Small things about the farm, about how her husband had died trying to save the cattle during a storm much like the last. She didn't know why she spoke. Maybe it was the quiet. Maybe it was the way Calder listened, really listened, without judgment, without pity. "My neighbors," she said, voice low. "They think I should have left with him. That I'm just stubborn." "Foolish?" Calder shifted slightly, his boots scraping against the floor. "You ain't foolish," he said. "You're standing. That's more'n most." The words were plain, rough, but to Eloise they felt like a balm on wounds she didn't realize were still bleeding. She looked at him, at the deep lines carved into his face, the scar that marred one side of it. She wondered, not for the first time, what storms he had survived, and whether some were still chasing him. But she didn't ask. Some burdens weren't meant to be shared. Not yet. Later, when she climbed into bed, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Outside, the wind had died, but another storm brewed. One that stirred not the dust, but the heart. And somewhere deep inside her chest, where grief had made its home, something unfamiliar stirred. Something dangerously close to hope. Morning broke over a land cloaked in silence. The storm had stripped the world of color. leaving only the brittle yellows and muted browns of a dying season. Eloise stood at the kitchen window, her hands wrapped around a chipped mug, watching the emptiness stretch toward the horizon. The two other cowboys had gone at first light. She heard the creak of saddles, the muted clop of hooves, and when she peered through the lace curtain, they were already riding away, small figures swallowed by the dust. She felt a strange pang as she watched them go, a loneliness sharpened by the brief, fragile company they had offered. But Calder hadn't moved. He sat on the porch, a broad shadow against the thin morning sun, whittling a piece of wood with a knife that flashed silver in the light. The soft rasp of blade against bark was the only sound between them. Eloise finished her coffee, set the mug down with a click louder than she intended, and pushed open the door. "You planning on staying?" she asked, folding her arms. Calder looked up from his carving. His eyes were clear, steady. "No call to leave yet," he said simply. Eloise raised an eyebrow. "You ain't obligated. I fed you, that's all." He shrugged, a small roll of his shoulders that somehow carried the weight of a man who had no ties, no place to go. "Storm ain't done what it's gonna do yet," he said. "Best not ride blind into it." It was a practical answer, a safe answer, but Eloise sensed there was more beneath it, something unspoken, like a river running deep beneath cracked earth. She nodded once, accepting it. In truth, she didn't mind the company. Not really. The farm had been silent for too long. Her husband's absence had hollowed out the house, and the whispers of the town had kept her isolated even longer. A stranger sitting quiet on her porch was no worse than the ghosts she lived with. Days slipped by. They worked side by side, patching fences, clearing debris, tending to the few animals that had survived the storm. Calder said little. Eloise said less. But a rhythm settled between them, a silent understanding built on necessity and something else, something harder to name. At night, they sat by the fire. Calder would whittle or polish his battered saddle gear, while Eloise mended worn clothes or simply stared into the flames, letting the heat thaw places inside her she thought were frozen for good. Sometimes, when the fire popped or the wind groaned, through the cracks she would catch Calder watching her with that same steady look. Not like a man sizing up a woman, not like a man measuring weakness, but like a man who recognized a kind of strength he understood too well. Still, he never crossed the invisible line between them, never tried to fill the silence with useless words, and for that Eloise was quietly grateful. On the fourth night, she found herself speaking without meaning to. "My husband," she said, voice rough. "He died trying to save a steer, just one. Couldn't bear to let it die alone." Calder said nothing, but he set his knife aside, giving her his full, heavy attention. "They blamed me," she continued, staring at her hands. "Said if I hadn't begged him to stay on the farm, he might have gone to town, taken work somewhere safer." The fire crackled between them. Calder leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his voice low and certain when he finally spoke. "People gotta blame someone. Makes the hurt cleaner, easier." Eloise met his gaze then, and in that moment she knew. This man had been blamed for things that weren't his fault, had carried guilt he didn't earn. She swallowed hard, her throat tight. "You know something about that, don't you?" A flicker of something, pain, regret, passed through Calder's eyes, but he only nodded once, a sharp, almost invisible gesture. They said no more that night. But something shifted between them, as real and tangible as the weight of dust still, piled against the walls. The next morning broke colder than before, a biting wind sweeping across the barren fields and rattling the windows in their frames. The sky was a bleached, hollow color, too bright, too empty. The kind of sky that made a soul feel small. Eloise woke early, driven by habit more than purpose. There was always something to tend to, even if the land had little left to give. She found Calder already outside, mending a broken gate with slow, careful movements. His presence was steady, like a stone placed against the river of loneliness trying to pull her under. They worked side by side through the morning, exchanging few words but many glances, small moments of understanding that didn't need explaining. By noon, Calder saddled his horse. Eloise watched from the porch, a hollow forming in her chest. She hadn't asked him to stay. He hadn't promised anything. She told herself she had no right to expect anything more from a man whose life was a path carved by solitude. He adjusted the stirrups, checked the reins, and swung into the saddle with a grace that spoke of years spent riding farther than most would dare. She thought he would ride off without a word, the way wild things vanished into the trees. But Calder paused at the edge of the yard, his horse shifting beneath him. He touched the brim of his hat, a small, silent farewell, and then turned his mount toward the road. Eloise stood there long after he disappeared into the dust. The house felt emptier than before, not because he had spoken much or filled the rooms with noise, but because he had filled the spaces between silences with something warm, something she hadn't realized she needed until it was gone. The next day passed like a slow, painful ache. Eloise did what she always did. Fixed what she could, mended what she couldn't, and tried not to let hope sprout in the cracks of her heart. Hope was a dangerous thing out here. It grew easy, but it withered fast. By sundown, a brittle loneliness had settled into her bones. She ate a thin stew alone at the kitchen table, staring at the empty chair across from her, and told herself it was better this way. She was washing the dishes when she heard it, a low, distant rumble. She froze, the cracked plate slipping in her fingers. The sound grew louder, a deep, steady thunder that wasn't the storm returning. Heart hammering, she rushed to the porch. At first, all she could see was the dust stirred up in the distance, but then shapes began to form, dark against the dying light. Riders, dozens of them, maybe more, spread out in a long, slow line across the road leading toward her farm. For a terrible moment, panic seized her. Was this some kind of raiding party? Had Calder brought trouble to her door without meaning to? She gripped the edge of the porch rail until her knuckles turned white. As the riders drew closer, she could make out their faces, men wearing battered hats, their clothes worn and dusty, their horses lean but determined. And at the front, leading them with that same silent gravity, was Calder. He rode like a man returning to a place he had chosen, not one he had stumbled upon. Behind him, the riders carried bundles slung across their saddles, sacks of grain, tools, lumber, barrels of water, crates of food, supplies. They weren't a raiding party. They were a rescue. Eloise pressed a hand to her mouth, her knees threatening to buckle. The men reined in near the porch, tipping their hats respectfully. Calder dismounted with slow, deliberate movements and approached the steps, the dust swirling around his boots. He didn't smile. He didn't speak. He simply set a heavy burlap sack at her feet, flour by the smell of it, and gave a single solemn nod. Eloise stared at him, words catching in her throat. "Why?" she whispered, the question escaping before she could stop it. Calder's voice was rough when he finally answered. "Storm took from you. We aim to give back." The other men began unloading, supplies working quickly, efficiently. No one asked for thanks. No one expected payment. Eloise stood frozen, the enormity of it crashing over her harder than any dust storm ever could. A kindness given without expectation. And now kindness returned 100-fold. The wind kicked up around them, but this time it wasn't a harbinger of loss. It was a herald of something new, something she hadn't dared believe in for a long, long time. Hope. The farm, once a place of echoes and brittle silence, now bustled with life. The clatter of hammers against wood, the rhythmic scrape of shovels, the low murmur of voices, all wove together into a kind of music Eloise hadn't realized she missed. The riders, these dusty, worn men who looked like they'd been carved from the very bones of the frontier, moved with quiet purpose. They repaired the broken fences, reinforced the sagging barn, even patched the holes in the farmhouse roof where the last storm had left the stars peeking through. They didn't ask questions. They didn't tell stories. They simply worked, as if Eloise's small act of kindness during the storm had stitched an invisible thread between them all, binding them to her in a way deeper than any contract. Calder oversaw much of it, speaking in low tones when needed, but otherwise remaining his usual silent self. He was a force without needing to dominate, a leader without wearing the name. Eloise moved among them, her heart tight with conflicting emotions: gratitude, disbelief, fear that it would all crumble if she dared to lean on it too much. She carried water to the men, cooked what little she had left in the pantry, and when that ran out, some of the riders produced sacks of beans, rice, even salt pork from their saddlebags. They ate around a makeshift fire near the barn, laughter occasionally breaking the air like small bursts of sunlight through heavy clouds. Yet, amid the warmth, Eloise felt the weight of eyes, not from the riders, from the land beyond. She caught glimpses of it, curtains twitching in distant farmhouses, shapes lingering on the ridge at dusk. The town was watching and judging. In this hard land, a woman alone was expected to suffer silently, not to invite a small army of strangers into her home. Whispers would follow. They always did. That night, as the last of the nails were driven and the repairs finished, Calder approached her on the porch. The stars sprawled overhead, brilliant and cold, and the wind carried the scent of freshly turned earth. Eloise clutched her shawl tighter around her shoulders, heart pounding as Calder stopped a few feet away, hat in hand. "You saved us," he said simply, voice low and rough. "Men like us, we don't forget that." Eloise shook her head, struggling to find her voice. "I only did what anyone decent would do." Calder's eyes, pale and piercing, held hers. "No, ma'am. Decent folks turned us away before. You didn't." The words settled between them, heavy and true. Eloise looked away, blinking against the sting in her eyes. She wasn't used to being seen. Not really. Not since the day the town turned its back on her, blaming her for surviving where her husband hadn't. "Don't expect the town to take kindly to it," she said, forcing a brittle smile. "They'll say I've gone soft in the head, or worse." Calder's mouth curved, not quite a smile, but something close. Town's been wrong before. He offered her something then, not protection, not promises, just a kind of solidarity. An acknowledgement that standing against the tide didn't make her foolish, it made her brave. The riders stayed one more night. At dawn, they packed their gear, tightened saddles, and mounted up. One by one, they tipped their hats to Eloise, some offering murmured thanks, others simply nodding as they rode out into the pale morning light. Calder was the last to leave. He lingered at the edge of the yard, hat low over his eyes, horse shifting beneath him. Eloise stepped off the porch, the cold morning biting at her skin. "Will you come back?" she asked, surprising even herself with the question. For a long moment, Calder said nothing. Then, with that same slow gravity that seemed part of his bones, he nodded once. "When the time's right," he said. And with that, he turned and rode after the others, disappearing into the endless stretch of land. Eloise watched until he was nothing but a shadow against the rising sun, her heart full in a way it hadn't been in years. The dust might still cling to the earth, the whispers might still swirl like storms waiting to strike, but something had shifted. Hope had found a foothold here, and it would not be easily uprooted. The days after the riders left were sharper somehow, as if the very air carried edges. Eloise went about her work with a new kind of energy, mending the fence lines the men had fortified, planting seeds in the stubborn soil, sweeping the dust from her floors with a lighter hand. For the first time in too long, the future didn't seem like a sentence to endure. It seemed like something she could build. But hope, she learned quickly, made a woman a target. The first sign came with the visit from Mrs. Hartley, the preacher's wife. Eloise heard the creak of the wagon before she saw it, the shrill neigh of a horse tugging against the bit. She wiped her hands on her apron and stepped onto the porch just as Mrs. Hartley descended, skirts brushing the dust. "Good morning, Eloise," she said too sweetly. Eloise forced a polite nod. "Morning." Mrs. Hartley adjusted her bonnet, eyes flicking over the freshly repaired barn, the new timber framing the porch, the neat rows of supplies stacked by the wall. She smiled thinly. Quite a blessing you received, she said, voice pitched to carry judgment under the veneer of kindness. Suppose it is, Eloise answered carefully. Mrs. Hartley clucked her tongue. We were all praying for you, dear. Some of us feared you'd turned away from the Lord, seeking help from wandering menfolk and all. The accusation, though wrapped in piety, hit harder than a slap. Eloise stiffened. She knew how the town worked. Mercy was a currency, traded only when it suited appearances. Her act of compassion, her refusal to let men die outside her door, had somehow made her a subject of suspicion. I did what was right, Eloise said, her voice steady. Mrs. Hartley's lips pursed. Sometimes, appearances are as important as actions. You understand that, surely. Eloise smiled then, a real smile, sharp as a knife. Seems to me God sees more than appearances. For a moment, the older woman's eyes flashed with something that might have been anger or fear. Without another word, Mrs. Hartley gathered her skirts and climbed back into the wagon, snapping the reins with more force than necessary. As the wagon rattled away, Eloise exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the encounter settle over her. It was only the beginning. Over the next week, small cruelties multiplied like weeds. The storekeeper, Mr. Delaney, weighed her flour twice and charged her double. The blacksmith, usually kind, barely nodded when she passed. Children who once waved at her now turned away under their mother's sharp glares. Eloise bore it all in silence. She had survived worse. But late at night, lying awake in the dark, the loneliness gnawed at her, sharper than any whisper. She thought of Calder sometimes, wondered where he was, whether he thought of her. She pictured his steady hands repairing her fence, the way his eyes softened when he listened without trying to fix her grief. He had said he would return, but promises made under open skies had a way of being swallowed by distance. One evening, as the sun bled across the sky, Eloise stood at the edge of her fields, watching the wind ripple through the dry grass. A wagon rolled past on the distant road. She caught the shape of Mrs. Hartley again, head held high, a cluster of townsfolk seated behind her. They didn't wave, they didn't even glance her way. Eloise squared her shoulders. Let them whisper. Let them judge. She would not apologize for compassion. She would not bury her heart in bitterness just to make others comfortable. The dust storms had stripped away the land's softness. Maybe it was time she let them strip away her fear too. As she turned back toward the house, she thought she heard the faint sound of hooves in the distance. But when she looked, there was nothing there but the endless, waiting fields. The days blurred into each other, stitched together by routine and silence. But every evening, Eloise found herself standing on the porch, eyes sweeping the horizon as the sun dipped low, waiting, hoping, and then, one night, he came back. It wasn't dramatic. There was no thunder of hooves, no cry of warning, just a figure at the edge of the fields, walking his horse slow and steady toward her house, the sunset bleeding red behind him. Calder Boone. Dust clung to him, like a second skin, and his hat was pulled low over his eyes. But Eloise would have known him anywhere. Her heart hammered in her chest as she stepped off the porch, skirts tangling around her legs in the evening wind. She wanted to run to him, to ask why he had been gone so long, to demand whether he had meant the words he'd left her with. But when he finally stopped a few feet away, she saw it. The weariness in his shoulders, the shadows under his eyes. He hadn't just been traveling. He'd been carrying something. Without a word, Calder dismounted. He held the reins loosely in one hand, his other resting at his side like he wasn't sure if he should reach for her or keep his distance. "You came back," she said softly. He nodded, removing his hat and holding it against his chest. For a long moment they stood in the twilight, the world narrowing down to the two of them. Finally, Calder broke the silence. "Troubles following me," he said, voice low and rough. "Figured you ought to know." Eloise frowned. "What kind of trouble?" He looked away toward the dying light. "Back in Dry Creek," he said, "they pinned a crime on me. Something I didn't do. He didn't elaborate, didn't offer the kind of details a man would if he were trying to defend himself. He just laid it out plain. "I ran," he said. "Wasn't no trial worth trustin'. Town needed someone to blame. I fit." Eloise searched his face, the hard lines carved there, the scar slicing through his brow. She saw no fear, no pleading. Just the quiet resignation of a man used to carrying burdens others had forced onto his shoulders. She crossed her arms, considering. "Do you regret running?" she asked. Calder's jaw worked once, a muscle ticking there. "No," he said. "Only regret leaving folks behind who didn't deserve it." The words hung between them, heavy with things, unspoken. Eloise thought of her own life, how the town had turned against her after Samuel died, how the same people who once brought pies and flowers to her porch had crossed the street to avoid her. She knew what it was to be abandoned by those who should have stood by her. She knew what it was to survive it. "You ain't the only one who's been blamed for surviving," she said quietly. Calder lifted his gaze to meet hers, something raw and vulnerable flickering in those pale eyes. "I can leave," he said, "if you want." The offer was real, no pride, no bitterness. Just a man giving her the choice he had never been given. Eloise stepped closer, close enough to smell the dust and sweat and worn leather on him. Close enough to see the way his fingers tightened around the reins, like a man bracing for rejection. "No," she said simply. One word, enough to bridge the canyon between them. Relief didn't show on Calder's face, not exactly, but something in his stance eased, as if a weight too heavy to name had shifted, even just a little. She reached out and touched his sleeve, the rough fabric warm under her fingers. "You're not the only one with ghosts," she murmured. The wind stirred around them, carrying the scent of earth and old promises. For the first time in what felt like years, Eloise realized she wasn't just surviving anymore. She was choosing, and tonight, she chose him. The first sign that trouble was brewing came 2 days later. Eloise had risen early, tending the meager rows of beans sprouting stubbornly through the dust-choked earth. Calder was repairing a broken wheel on the cart, his hands steady, his face unreadable as ever. The morning was quiet, too quiet. It wasn't until the sound of horses drifted over the rise that Eloise straightened, wiping her hands on her apron. 5 riders approached, their shapes stark against the pale sky. She recognized them before they were close enough to speak. Mr. Delaney, the storekeeper, Reverend Hartley, and 3 other men who owned land farther west, men who had once shaken Samuel's hand, patted Eloise on the back after his funeral, then turned their backs the moment she needed them. They rode up with stiff backs and stony faces, forming a line before her porch. Calder stepped quietly to her side, his presence solid and wordless. "Morning, Eloise," Reverend Hartley said, removing his hat but not offering a smile. Eloise nodded, her jaw tightening. "Morning." The Reverend cleared his throat, glancing uneasily at Calder before fixing his gaze back on her. "We've come to talk," he said, "about certain concerns." Mr. Delaney shifted in his saddle. "You've taken in a wanted man, Eloise. Whole town knows it." Eloise felt Calder stiffen beside her, but he said nothing. She didn't need to look at him to know he was weighing every exit, every risk, every outcome. She took a step forward, lifting her chin. "I took in a man who needed help," she said. "Same as I would anyone." The Reverend's mouth pressed into a thin line. "It's not about charity, Miss McCarty. It's about safety, about appearances. Folks are uneasy, worried about their families." The lie tasted foul even from where she stood. This wasn't about safety, it was about control. About a woman who hadn't known her place, who hadn't stayed small and quiet. "You want me to put him out," she said flatly. A murmur of agreement passed between the riders. "It's for your own good," Delaney said, "and for the good of the community." Eloise laughed then, a brittle sound that surprised even her. "For my own good?" she repeated. "Where was this good when my husband died and no one came to help? Where was it when my roof leaked through 2 winters and no one crossed that road?" The men shifted uncomfortably. Reverend Hartley pressed on, voice oily with false concern. "You have a chance to make things right, Eloise, to return to the fold." Eloise looked past them, out at the barren fields, at the fences Calder had repaired, at the barn saved from collapse, at the tiny green shoots pushing through the dust, proof that life, even bruised and battered, still fought to exist. Then she turned back to them, her voice low but unshakable. "I have a family now," she said. "It might not look the way you want it to. It might not fit inside your church pews or your store ledgers, but it's mine." The Reverend's face hardened. "You'll regret this," he said, "when the town turns its back for good." Eloise smiled, and it wasn't bitter this time. It was the smile of a woman who had already lost everything once and learned she could live through it. "Then let 'em," she said. One by one, the riders turned their horses, spitting dust as they retreated. None of them looked back. Calder remained silent beside her as they watched the men disappear over the rise. Only when the dust settled did he speak, his voice rough as gravel. "You didn't have to do that." Eloise turned to him, heart pounding in her chest, feeling both terrified and exhilarated at the same time. "Neither did you," she said. "That night you stayed, that night you came back." For a moment, Calder just looked at her, his face carved, with shadows and secrets and something so raw it made her breath catch. Without a word, he reached out, slow, hesitant, and brushed a piece of wind-tangled hair from her face. The touch was feather-light, but it struck deeper than any kiss could have. They stood like that for a long, trembling moment, two broken souls daring to believe they could still be whole. And as the wind picked up again, carrying the scent of dust and distant storms, Eloise knew the worst wasn't over. But she also knew this: she wouldn't face it alone. The warning came at dusk. A boy, skinny, dust-streaked, no older than 12, rode up fast on a mule, panting so hard he could barely speak. "They're coming," he gasped, "with ropes." Then he turned and fled, the mule kicking up clods of dry earth as it disappeared into the gathering twilight. Eloise stood frozen on the porch, her heart a hammer against her ribs. She didn't need to ask who they were. The town. The ones who had decided that kindness was a crime, that mercy made a woman dangerous. Calder stepped beside her, his face hardening into something carved from stone. "How many?" he asked. Eloise swallowed. "Enough." They both knew what that meant. Calder moved fast after that, saddling his horse, checking the rifle strapped to the saddle, securing what few things might need saving. He didn't tell her to run. He didn't tell her to hide. He simply prepared, as if standing with her was the only choice that had ever made sense. Eloise moved too, gathering what she could, but her hands trembled. This land, this patch of stubborn hope, they would destroy it out of fear, out of spite. She turned to Calder, finding him tightening the saddle straps with slow, deliberate hands. "You should go," she said, voice breaking. Calder straightened, fixing her with that unwavering stare. "I ain't running," he said. A lump rose in her throat. "I don't want you hurt because of me," she whispered. A muscle ticked in Calder's jaw. He stepped closer, so close she could feel the heat radiating off him. "Been hurt before," he said. "Ain't gonna let it happen to you." Before she could answer, the sound of hooves broke the evening air. A dozen men or more crested the hill, lanterns swinging, guns glinting in the fading light. They moved in a tight, angry knot, their faces twisted with the righteousness of men who believed violence could wash away guilt. Eloise stood firm on the porch, Calder beside her, his hand resting lightly on the rifle at his hip but not yet raising it. The mob stopped a few yards from the house. Reverend Hartley rode to the front, holding a rope coiled loosely in his gloved hand. "You've been warned, Eloise," he called out. "Hand him over. We'll do what needs doing, and you can go back to your life." A hush fell over the land, broken only by the whine of the wind and the distant groan of the barn doors swaying on their hinges. Eloise took a breath, feeling the dust coat her lungs, feeling the weight of the moment settle into her bones. She stepped forward. "I am living my life," she said, her voice carrying across the broken field. Reverend Hartley's face darkened. "Don't be foolish, girl." Calder's hand brushed hers, just once, just enough to steady her. "You'll have to go through me," Calder said then, his voice quiet but carrying like a gunshot. For a long, moment, the mob hesitated. They hadn't come expecting a fight. They had come expecting fear. And now, faced with two figures standing shoulder to shoulder against them, some of their fire faltered. Mr. Delaney shifted nervously in his saddle. One of the younger men at the back turned his horse slightly, already thinking of excuses to leave. Reverend Hartley glared. "You're making a mistake," he spat. Calder said nothing, Eloise said nothing, but they stood their ground. And in that silence, the mob broke. One by one they peeled away, muttering curses, spitting into the dust. But they didn't cross the porch. They didn't dare. Soon, only the Reverend remained, the rope still dangling uselessly from his hand. He looked at them, at the woman who had refused to be cowed, at the man who had chosen loyalty over fear. And for the first time, he looked small. He turned his horse without another word and rode back into the dark. Eloise sagged slightly, the tension draining from her all at once. Calder caught her elbow gently, steadying her. "You all right?" he asked, voice low. She looked up at him, at the man who had chosen to stand when so many others had turned away. For the first time in a long, bitter season, Eloise allowed herself to believe she wasn't alone anymore, and she never would be again. In the days that followed, the world didn't change all at once. The sky was still heavy with dust. The fields were still cracked and stubborn. The town still turned its back when Eloise rode in for supplies. But none of it mattered like it once had. Because when Eloise returned home each evening, there was Calder, repairing a fence, mending a tool, carving something with quiet patience on the porch steps. And for the first time in a long time, the house didn't feel like a tomb. It felt like a beginning. They never spoke much about what had happened that night the mob came. Some things didn't need words. The trust forged in that standoff was stronger than any apology, any explanation. It was there in the way Calder would reach for her hand without thinking when they crossed the fields together. It was there in the way Eloise would pour 2 cups of coffee in the morning instead of 1, without even asking if he wanted it. Spring crept across the land slowly, like a wounded animal testing its legs. The seeds Eloise had planted, the ones she had almost given up on, began to sprout, thin green tendrils pushing bravely through the dry earth. Life, battered but unbroken. One evening, after the last rays of sun had slipped behind the hills, Calder set aside the saddle he was oiling and joined her at the porch rail. For a long time, they just stood there, watching the stars blink into existence one by one. Finally, Calder cleared his throat. "I ain't much of a talker," he said. Eloise smiled softly. "I noticed." He shifted, awkward in a way she had never seen before. A man more comfortable facing down a mob than speaking his heart. "But if you'd have me," he said gruffly, "I'd stay. Not just till the work's done. Not just till the storms pass." Her throat tightened. She turned to him fully, seeing the way he stood there, raw, uncertain, offering everything he had with nothing but a few halting words. "You're already home," she said simply. For a moment, Calder just looked at her, as if committing every detail of her face to memory. Then he reached out, slow and sure, and took her hand. No grand declarations, no promises carved in gold. Just 2 scarred, stubborn souls choosing each other in the quiet, battered corners of the world. Later, when they sat by the fire, shoulders brushing, silence wrapped around them like a second skin, Eloise allowed herself to imagine a future again. Not a perfect one. There would still be storms. Still be harsh winters and lean harvests and whispered words in town. But there would also be mornings where Calder handed her a cup of coffee with a shy glance. Evenings where she leaned against him under a sky so wide it swallowed all their old hurts whole. A life. A real, stubborn, beautiful life. As the fire crackled and the wind sighed against the windows, Eloise closed her eyes and let the warmth seep into her bones, The dust might always cling to this land, the scars might always run deep. But here, in this small pocket of the world, something stronger had taken root, hope. And this time, it was here to stay.
Sometimes, the strongest kind of love isn't shouted from rooftops, it's built quietly, day by day, in the face of storms. If this story touched your heart, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment sharing what part spoke to you most. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more tales of hope, courage, and unexpected redemption. Thank you for being here.